Welcome to Books in 5, where we are interviewing the authors of recently published books on relevant topics. I'm very excited about my guest today, as he is one of Canada's most respected political thinkers. Andrew, I'm so glad you could join us today. Please tell us your name, the title of your book, and a little bit more about your background.
My name is Andrew Coyne. The book is called The Crisis of Canadian Democracy. The third question was?
A little bit more about your background, yeah.
I've been doing the journalism thing now for, I guess, 40 odd years. It still seems new to me. I got into journalism mostly because I couldn't think what else to do with my life and my career, but it in hindsight, it turns out to have been the right choice. I was always interested in words, always interested in arguing about things. So it turns out to have been a good choice.
And you're currently with the Globe and Mail and
I'm at
CBC,
the Globe and
right?
Mail. It's my second tour of duty at the Globe. I started out there, not started out there, but I was there in the early 90s, and here I am again.
Great. Let's begin with our first question. The foundational institution of Canadian democracy is supposed to be Parliament, but the book highlights its weakened existence in the present day. Walk us through how it has not measured up to the task of holding the government to account.
Sure. Well, the book is sort of laid out as a series of almost like relationships. And there's the relationship or the institutional arrangement that we think we have, and there's the one that we actually have. So I look at the party leaders versus the party caucus, the government versus the parliament, the prime minister versus the cabinet. In each of these cases, we think there's a relationship where the leader is accountable to the caucus, the governor is accountable to the parliament, the prime minister is at least part of a functioning cabinet. And it turns out that's not really the case, that the caucus is absolutely dominated by the leader. The government pretty effortlessly gets its way with parliament, and the prime minister basically governs more or less alone. The cabinet is mostly for show. I'm exaggerating, but only slightly. So when you look at, for example, the government versus the parliament, and when I say the government, I basically mean the prime minister, there's so many powers that a prime minister, particularly in possession of the majority, has that allows him or her to essentially go around or go over or ignore parliament. The power of dissolution, that is to say, to call for an election to be called at the time that's most advantageous to the prime minister, even though supposedly there's legislation that restricts that, but they all ignore it. The power of prorogation, we've seen most recently, Justin Trudeau prorogued Parliament when he was assured he was going to lose a confidence vote. Well, you shouldn't be able to get around a confidence vote. The basic principle of Parliament is you always have to have the confidence of the Parliament. The powers to cut short debate through what's called time allocation whenever that's advantageous. The power to pack all sorts of different bills together into one omnibus bill makes it impossible to know what Parliament meant. So when you look at, when we send MPs to Parliament to represent us, what do we think they're able to do? We think they can propose legislation. Well, private members' bills almost never get passed. Most MPs will go through their whole careers without ever passing one. We think that they're going to debate legislation. Well, as I say, whenever the debate gets going, that's really likely to have any impact. They cut short the debate. Critiquing, scrutinizing legislation, well, omnibus bills basically put paid to that. And then finally, when it comes to voting on legislation, well, the data on this is pretty clear. MPs vote with their party 99.6% of the time. So the notion that they're exercising any kind of independent judgment or even representing their constituents, depending on what your theory of representation is, neither of them really holds. They're not exercising their own individual judgment. They're not representing their constituents. They're basically foot soldiers for the party, and their job is to not just vote the party line, but even more so in recent times, message discipline, staying on the party message in every public utterance, not just in debates in Parliament, which are typically written for them, not just in their members' statements or the questions that they ask in question period, but even on things like Twitter. Or press releases. They're all, if they're not literally written by party headquarters, they might as well have been, because they're all stamped out in almost the same exact wording.
Andrew, we got about 90 more seconds for this question, and you brought it up a little bit earlier, but I want to dive deeper into it about the power the prime minister has to call elections. Can you tell us more about how that helps the government overpower Parliament?
Well, in two ways. One is the government will constantly threaten that such and such is a confidence vote. And there's no necessity for that. There's obviously some bills, some pieces of legislation that are really and truly matters of confidence in the government, a budget, for example. But it's an abuse of power to extend that to every little piece of legislation, every motion, et cetera, which typically in the past, particularly, they've tended to do. So that's one way. A second way is that they call an election at the time that's most advantageous to them in the polls. Well, why should the government of the day have that extra advantage? They have all kinds of advantages anyway. And that was the thinking behind passing legislation, as virtually, I think, every province and the federal government did in the early 2000s, to mandate a fixed date for elections. So it would be a level playing field. The problem is they built in a loophole into these legislations that basically allows them to ignore it. We weren't told that at the time. At the time, we were told this is a real constraint on the discretion of the prime minister. It turned out to be not such a discretion, such a constraint. And we've seen both the Harper government and the Trudeau government make use of this to call elections in defiance of that law, and basically just at the time that was most advantageous to them.
Andrew, let's move on to our second question. Your writing reveals that whoever sits as Prime Minister in Ottawa has wielded tremendous power in undemocratic ways. Can you detail how both the caucus and cabinet have been sidelined?
Yeah, so the Prime Minister sort of sits at the intersection of two broad trends in Canadian democracy in recent decades. One is, that I mentioned earlier, which is the power of any party leader over his or her caucus. And that power is extensive. It basically, most MPs, for example, most candidates will be chosen not by an open election in their riding, but by the party leader. The party leader will appoint them. Certainly, if they want to run again, they're going to have to be get the party leader's approval. It's only about 1 in 5 nomination races that are actually decided by open races. And even though those tend to be kind of disgraceful in their own way because they involve busloads of instant members, et cetera. So the party leader basically controls the lives of their caucus. If you want any kind of advance, if you want to be on a committee, if you want to be a critic, if you want to be a cabinet minister, you keep your nose clean. And it's been compounded by the fact that not only does the party leader essentially choose members of caucus, but members of caucus no longer have not had the power for 100 years to choose the leader. And that's the classic Westminster model. It's just a common sense that you govern with the consent of the governed. That should apply to parties as well as any other institution. And yet uniquely, members of caucus have to submit to the dictates of a leader that they had no hand in choosing. So it just makes the leader entirely impervious to caucus discipline. So that's the party leaders, of which the prime minister is one. Now you add on top of that all these powers that the leader of the government has that we mentioned: proroguing, dissolution, cutting off debate, omnibus bills, et cetera. So the prime minister has unique powers by virtue of that. Then on top of that, he or she has remarkable powers of appointment. Virtually every senior official in the government is directly appointed by the prime minister. All of the, first of all, every member of the Senate, every member of the Supreme Court, every deputy minister, every head of every crown corporation, all the way on down. And where it gets really pernicious is in the last couple of decades, it's emerged that the prime minister now appoints the chiefs of staff to his cabinet ministers. Cabinet ministers don't get to choose their own chiefs of staff. And when you think of what an extraordinarily close relationship that historically has been between a minister and his or her chief of staff, how you would think that would be such a symbiotic, close relationship. And yet basically they're put there as minders to make sure that they toe the line and don't get, they report literally back to the prime minister's chief of staff, not to the minister. Now, classically, the prime minister was thought of as being the first among equals in cabinet, the primus inter pares. That's long been untrue, but in Canada, we've taken that to levels that are quite extraordinary because we've allowed the cabinet to grow so large. I mean, typical cabinets in recent years have been close to 40 members, vastly larger than any other democracy. literally true. We have the largest democracy, the largest cabinet in the democratic world by far. Even the trimmed down cabinet under Mark Carney is still larger, I think, than virtually every other democracy except maybe Israel. And the effect of that, first of all, the point of that, the reason it's gotten so large is we've treated cabinet as being a body for representation rather than a body for governing the country. So we make sure that every region and every language group and every demographic group is represented. And look, I'm not naive. Up to a point, that's part of politics, but we've just taken it to such an extreme. The cabinet's become so large that individual ministers have dwindled in significance. And there's legions of stories of how basically they get overruled or ignored by the prime minister, who just bigfoots them and brings in legislation that they had no hand, weren't even consulted on. There's been memoirs that came out during the Trudeau years by senior cabinet ministers: Bill Morneau, the finance minister; Mark Garneau, the foreign affairs minister; Jody Wilson-Raybould, the minister of justice. And the theme of all of them is basically, I had no input. I couldn't even get a meeting with the prime minister. Wilson-Raybould was the exception. She had all too many meetings where he tried to interfere in her, constitutionally guaranteed independence when it came to a criminal prosecution, which, the prime minister should have no hand in whatsoever. So individually, ministers have lost significance. Collectively, a body of 40 is not a serious deliberating body. Anything beyond about 18, it becomes just chaos. And literally in Canadian cabinet meetings, they're put on a timer. Like, you have 20 seconds to make your point. Come on, it's just it's a travesty. And so you put all those things together, and the Prime Minister of Canada is, by common expert consent, the most powerful head of government of any Western democracy.
Andrew, let's transition to our third question. Regardless of party, the campaigns themselves are tarnishing democracy in Canada. Help us understand what the people running for office and their managers are doing that degrades our politics.
Well, I mean, and on this one, I mean, on a lot of these other trends, I would say, and one of the points I try to make in the book is we're far worse than any other country. There's a tendency in Canada to say, oh, problems everywhere, or it's always been this way. And I tried to show, no, it's gotten worse, and it's here, and it's worse than it is in other countries. Are our campaigns, as sleazy as they are they necessarily worse than other countries? Probably not, but they're part of the overall picture. And one thing I do think that's gotten worse in Canada, maybe worse than other countries, is the particular phenomenon of just flat out lying during a campaign. And particularly what I mean by that is making a promise, and not a minor, slip of the lip, or a promise that you could be taken two ways or wasn't that important. But we've had example after example of parties running for office on a central campaign plank that when they get into office, they do the exact opposite. Now, I don't care how cynical you are about politics or how much leeway you want to get. That's just that you do that over and over again. It just absolutely destroys people's ability to judge between the parties, and it destroys their faith in the politicians. And when you see interviews with voters and focus group data and polling data on why they don't vote, for example, one of the things that comes up and again is, I can't trust them. I can't trust that they'll keep their word about what they'll do when they get into power. And I understand that circumstances can change, and sometimes you can't be held to something that you thought you could. But the examples are so numerous and so blatant that at some point you say, "Come on, you knew, or you should have known that this was a promise you couldn't keep or weren't prepared to keep." I mean, look at, for example, Justin Trudeau's promise of electoral reform. There's just no way to interpret that except just rank cynicism. So one of the things I try to propose is, what do we do about this? And I don't want a truth squad, running around calling, arresting politicians or anything. But I try to think, well, what happens in the private sector? Because the real problem this brings up is, how do we trust the good guys? How do we know when somebody's actually telling the truth? How do they make it known? Because they're all now in such bad odor. And I tried to look at, what did we do in the private sector? Well, in the private sector, we have all kinds of institutions we've evolved over the centuries where somebody can establish their bona fides, their good faith. I swear an oath, or I bonded couriers, or I give you a money back guarantee. All kinds of things that basically say, I'm going to willingly assume consequences, legal or otherwise, if I don't keep my word to you. And that way I can establish to you, even though you don't know me personally, that I'm trustworthy. Is it so far-fetched to think that we could institute something in the political realm where when a party leader or a party candidate really wanted to make it known, okay, this is not standard blarney, I really mean this, they could willingly invoke legal consequences. It'd be up to them to opt into it. But it would give us a way, and at that point it would be a question, why aren't you invoking this clause? All too good. And sure, they would probably be very careful in how they hedged their promise. That's all to good as well. I think it's entirely appropriate to say, for example, we'll balance the budget unless there's a recession. Something like that seems just sensible to me. So that's one of the issues I looked at in that chapter. Another is the attack ads that become such, a central part of our campaigns. There's such, we don't really attempt to establish arguments in elections. We just basically try to tear down the other guy as much as we possibly can. Part of that's built into our electoral system, but part of it is they raise a lot of money for that purpose, to buy a lot of odious attack ads. And generally what happens is the party leader stays above the fray and he just allows his minions to concoct these ads, and there's a sort of a separability. So one of the things I propose to try to get around that is, we've all seen these American ads where at the end the candidate or leader has to come on and say, I'm so-and-so and I approve these ads. That doesn't seem to have done the trick. So I'm proposing we go one step further and make the candidate voice the ads. They could still say whatever they like. Free speech would rule, but you'd have to take ownership of it. You couldn't pretend that, I had nothing to do with that. You'd have to voice these odious lines where you say, can we really trust so-and-so? And I suspect that we get a lot less of it if they actually had to attach their voice and name to it.
Andrew, let's move on to our fourth question. Elections are a critical aspect of how Canadians choose their leaders, but your book describes how they are not set up for true representation. How does the system of casting and counting votes operate in an undemocratic way?
Well, we have what's called a first past the post system. And what that means is we elect one MP per riding, and it's just whoever has the most votes gets in. They don't have to have a majority. Oftentimes they're elected with 30% or even less sometimes, depending on how the vote splits. That seems natural and normal to us. Most Canadians have never known any other system. In fact, we're one of the few countries on earth, certainly few advanced developed democracies, who use first past the post. Most countries on earth, most of the democracies that we're familiar with, use some form of proportional representation. Well, how does that work? Well, first of all, what's the problem with our current system? Well, when it's only the one candidate who's elected in each riding with 30%, 40%, whatever it is of the vote, basically the votes of the other 60, 70% might as well not have been counted. They're not represented in the parliament. They're legally and technically represented. They have an MP, but their views aren't being represented. And that surely is the point of the exercise. And so what proportional systems try to do, let me hold on that point. The consequence of that, when you sum it over all the ridings, so there's a disproportionality built into at each riding level. When you sum it across all the ridings, you get these wildly distorted results where the number of MPs a party elects is just way out of whack with the number of votes that it got. And again, built from those individual riding disproportions. Particularly, it favors parties that can clump their vote geographically over parties where the vote is spread more evenly, because the name of the game is to have the most votes in any one riding. Well, in a country like Canada, at the federal level particularly, that just causes all sorts of problems. We're divided enough as it is. We're naturally going to have divisions because we're spread out over an entire continent. But it takes those divisions and makes them far worse. So, for example, everyone's talking about how in this election the Liberals were quote unquote shut out of Alberta. No, they got 30% of the vote in Alberta. They did better there than they've done since 1968. But they still only got 2 seats because that's the way first past the post works. Now, I would be the first to say I think the Liberals have over the years not been particularly sympathetic to Alberta's concerns and to Western Canada's concerns generally. But if you're a Liberal and you were being sort of cynical / honest, you'd say, well, why should I be paying that much attention to Alberta? I can't win any seats there. And if you were being even more cynical / honest, you'd say, why should I pay attention? Because I don't need to win seats in Alberta because I've already racked up my majority in Ontario and Quebec. Basically by the same process in reverse. You only need to get 40% of the vote in Ontario and you run home with 100 seats. So it creates these kind of regional ghettos where, the Conservatives sweep Western Canada as if they had all the votes. Well, no, there's lots of people who vote NDP. There's lots of people who vote Liberal in Western Canada. The Liberals or the Bloc have typically, swept Quebec as if there were no Conservatives in Quebec, which is not true. So it creates this just funhouse distortion of what the country is actually like. And, it has all kinds of consequences. We elect governments with phony majorities that then enact sweeping changes to laws that then get reversed by the next government that comes in with its phony majority. So that's a problem in itself. But I think particularly this problem of the accentuating regional differences, and think of it in reverse. Supposing we had a system in which every party could win seats in every part of Canada, and in which every party had to win seats in every part of Canada because they couldn't just win a majority in one part or the other. I think you'd see a very different politics. You'd see national politics, national parties, rather than the regionalized politics we have. Well, how do we get there? Well, it's very simple. What's common to all proportional systems is instead of having one member per riding, you have several. So if you get, and this is in very broad brush terms, but let's say you had 5 MPs per riding. It doesn't quite work like this, but it's close enough. If you get 20% of the vote, you get 1 of the 5. If you get 40% of the vote in that riding, you get 2 of the 5. When you aggregate it over all the ridings, the number of seats you have looks something similar to the number of votes you got. And it would sort of unwind all of these problems that are associated with first past the post. Well, okay, if there were some divine law or some law of physics that said you could only have 1 member per riding, then that would be impossible and it would be silly to be discussing it. And a lot of times when people dismiss proportional representation, I think they've kind of got this fixed in their head of they're just sore losers or something. But if there's no such law, if we can have more than 1 member per riding, why wouldn't we do it? Why wouldn't we want to represent most people in a riding rather than just the sliver that happened to vote for the winning, quote unquote, winning party? Isn't the point of election to Parliament to represent us? And so that's the broad brush analysis of what our electoral system is doing to our politics and how we can fix it.
Andrew, let's conclude with our final question. There is a disconnect between the self-image Canadians have of their governing institutions and the reality. Why is it so difficult to move away from this flawed system? And what recommendations would you suggest to help improve democracy in the nation?
Yeah. Well, part of it is, we're a pretty successful country by any measure. We've got our problems, we've made our share of mistakes, but you compare us to most countries across most measures, we've done pretty well. I would say that's in spite of, not because of our democratic failings, but it does induce a certain degree of complacency. And on certain measures of our democracy, we look pretty good, especially if we're looking south of the border these days. The paper balloting system works really well. We don't have a lot of election fraud or corruption or threats of force, people standing over you while you're, so by those kind of measures, we do pretty well. But that's setting the bar awfully low to say, oh, well, our elections aren't rigged, therefore we're in great shape. I think the problem is we're very good at observing the forms and the rituals of democracy, and we don't look carefully enough at the substance of it. So we give everyone a single piece of paper, that's true, to vote on, but we don't really have one person, one vote in effective terms. If you recall that discussion we had about proportional representation, the votes of some parties, for some parties, are worth many times what the votes for other parties were. I think in broad, this is rough and ready, but something like this in a typical election, it'll take 30,000 votes to elect each Liberal, 40,000 votes to elect each Conservative, 80,000 to elect each New Democrat, and the Green Party gets 800,000 votes and elects 1 MP. So there's a wild disproportion in the effective weight of a vote, depending on which party you cast it for and in which riding. So that's not really according to any kind democratic principle. Well, if we handed out books of ballots with different numbers of votes to each person, we'd be doing the same thing substantively, but we'd suddenly realize how crazy this was, and we'd be rioting in the streets about it. So there's this difference between forms and substance. It's similarly, if somebody were to propose, you know what, we're not going to require a majority of the MPs to vote to pass legislation anymore. We're going to say it's enough to have 33% of the MPs. Well, again, people would say, that's crazy. You can't do that. This is a democracy. Majority rules. Well, which majority? The majority that counts isn't the majority of the people who happen to be standing around in the House of Commons. It's the idea that we have at the back of our minds that they represent a majority of the people. But they don't, right? That people talk about proportional representation would mean the end of majority governments. No, they'd mean the beginning of majority governments. The majority then would actually represent a majority of the citizens, a majority of the voters. It wouldn't be single party majorities anymore. It would be multi-party majorities, but more importantly, it'd be real majorities. So parties would have to, they'd have to negotiate with each other and find consensus, as they do in other mature democracies. We think of this as a weird idea. Well, most other countries say that's how it works. So that's the broad point there, is that we get lulled to sleep because we're observing the rituals, we're preserving the forms, and we don't ask ourselves enough of what's the substance underlying that. And then finally, part of the reason nothing changes is because the people who benefit from the system are in power. So you're asking to make any change, you're asking them to change the system that got them elected and delivered them into power. So there's been lots of proposals for changes on each of these things. So a lot of them, for example, if you're talking about the powers of the government versus parliament, again, meaning really the prime minister versus parliament, involve transferring some of these prerogatives that are today the exclusive prerogative of the prime minister to either the House of Commons at large. So let's say you'd have to have a supermajority of the House would have to vote to prorogue, for example, rather than just being the personal prerogative of the prime minister. Sometimes it involves transferring these things to the speaker. So right now, to ask questions in question, for example, a member of any party caucus has to get on a list that's compiled by the party establishment, which means you have to ask the questions that they want you to ask and word them the way that they want you to word them, et cetera. In other parliamentary democracies, Britain, for example, it's the speaker who decides who asks questions. Now, that might seem like a small thing, but and then you do that, then you have more freedom to ask the questions that you want to ask rather than what the party brass wants you to ask. Fast forward, we've had one glimmer of hope right now, which is the Reform Act, which was passed and was sponsored by Michael Chong, the Conservative MP. It had to be watered down a lot to get it in. But amongst the things that it provided for was that the caucuses could assume certain powers that are now held by the party leadership if the caucus voted after each election to assume it. So that provides that each party caucus has to hold a vote, and hold a meeting and hold a vote after each election and decide whether to give themselves these powers. Now, the problem is they didn't make it a secret ballot. So most parties, most of the time, the party leadership says, no, you don't want these powers, and the caucus votes, okay, we don't want these powers. The exception has been the Conservatives. And the Conservatives have voted in particular to assume the power to remove the party leader if the caucus so chooses. And they exercise this power vis-a-vis Aaron O'Toole, and they recently voted to arm themselves with that power vis-a-vis Pierre Poilievre. And you best believe that means Pierre Poilievre is going to be really careful to make sure he doesn't get offside with where the caucus is at. It's going to have to be much more accountable to them in the future. It even got the Liberals to look closely at it because of this experience they just went through, where they were stuck with Justin Trudeau for 2 years and couldn't get rid of him. At the end, they balked, but at least they're looking at it. And I'll just conclude on this point is, if we're ever going to get into these larger reforms, electoral system reform or reform of the parliamentary powers, you got to start somewhere. You got to reverse some of these vicious circles we're caught in now, where parliaments become so irrelevant, nobody cares that it's become irrelevant. If you can get even this power in for MPs, then do MPs at that point start looking at themselves a little differently? And do we start looking at MPs differently and stop assuming that they're nobodies and just their job is just to be step and fetchits for the party leader? And if MPs start saying, you know what, now that I have the power to remove the party leader, maybe I'd like to have the power to ask my own questions in question period. And maybe I'll talk to my caucus colleagues and we'll start putting that to the party leadership. You got to start somewhere. But maybe if you get the ball rolling, you can make some of these other larger reforms possible.
Andrew, that has been 5 questions. You've answered them in 5 minutes. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, the title of the book is The Crisis of Canadian Democracy. I will put a link to the book in the show notes. If you're not able to buy it, definitely check it out from your local library because it is a must read in 2025. Andrew, thank you for joining us.
Terrific. Nice to be part of it.
The host of Books in 5 is Bhavan Sodhan. Books in 5 is produced in collaboration with Podfather Creative in Vancouver, Canada.